Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I want to show you how to turn an artifact pot. The other day I was watching one of Richard Raffin's videos where he turns a green elm pot and then microwaves it and makes it warp. This is kind of one of Richard Raffin's style of pots that he's kind of known for, and I thought it was a really cool project, and they're really simple to turn. One of the nice things is too is you're using green wood, so you don't have to have dry material, and then microwaving them to warp them gives them a really cool, unique aesthetic, and it looks like something you'd find at a ancient ruin, you know, some primitive hunter-gatherer pot they'd use for storage. So it's kind of a cool little project. You know, it's a sub 20-minute type of project, but I'll show you how to turn it. Things I learned also from Richard Raffin's videos, and we'll get right into the turning process. All right, for blank selection, pick a piece of green wood. This is a piece of sycamore. It's roughly 4-inch cube. You can do elm, poplar, maple burl, figured maple. A lot of those will actually warp pretty cool when you dry them, especially the figured stuff, because the figured grain will leave a cool texture to the surface. But sycamore is known for warping pretty well. Like you can see on this, it's a nice off-center opening now and slightly oval. So I'm going to go with sycamore on this piece. And as far as cutting it for grain direction, this is cut for like a bowl grain orientation. So I'll get this mounted and show you my grain orientation here. So I've got spindle spinning low. Before that bottoms out, I'll stop the lathe and then just tighten this up by hand. This is a cool way to show the grain orientation. So we've got our end grain fibers here and here. They're going to be coming around this direction as opposed to spindle orientation. So I've got this running this direction. That's going to help prevent it from cracking, as well as just long-term durability, especially because these are pretty thin-walled. So make sure you have bowl grain orientation basically, and then make sure this is nice and locked down. We'll bring up our tailstock for a little extra support during the roughing process. Just get that nice and snug, lock everything down, and we can set up our tool rest. All right, once you have everything locked down, give that a quick spin, make sure you're not contacting the tool rest, and then put on your eye protection and have your dust collector going if you got one, or wear a dust mask. So again, bowl grain orientation, and we can just use a bowl gouge to start roughing this out, get around. I've got my 1/2-inch bowl gouge here. We'll just start roughing this out. Bring up my tool rest. Speed's about 1500 RPM. Adjust our tool rest in a little bit further. And then on this pot, I'll probably take 1/2 inch off the overall length. So I'll start stepping that down. And then we'll start working our rough shape. So this is the orientation of the pot. So we'll start rounding over the bottom of this, and then we'll cut our recess or our tenon here for our chuck. Just remove some of that bulk, try and get this to round. We can bring our tool rest in a little bit closer, and then we'll cut our tenon. And I'll be using the smaller VM100 with the standard 2.5-inch dovetail jaws. This thing, when it's closed, I close the jaws down. I want to get that closer to the jaws being closed because that's more of a perfect circle. And so you can kind of eyeball where you can use calipers to get your tenon for the right size. Get my spindle gouge to cut a clean tenon. And then come in from this side. Make sure that surface is nice and square for our chuck jaws. And then I like to just chamfer the corner of that tenon. It's not perfectly flat down in the corner. I'm going to get back in there and just square that up a little bit. Perfect. So we'll start getting the curvature here, and then we're going to neck down the opening of this pot so we can start removing a fair amount of material here. So I'll rotate my rest over just a touch. And then obviously I'm not going to reduce this all the way down because I'm going to hit the collar here on my screw chuck. But now I'm going to get rid of my tailstock. And then I'll bring my tool rest over to square off the bottom of this tenon. And then one thing that's worth noting is right here, so you always want to double check your tenon, make sure that that surface is nice and square to register against the face of the jaws. That's going to be where a lot of that grip strength comes from. And then obviously the taper of your tenon to match the profile of the chuck jaws you're using, because some of them do vary. The one-way ones are a little more straight. The Vicmark ones have definitely more of a dovetail to them. So make your tenon appropriate for your chuck that you'll be using. All right. Okay, I think we're pretty good roughed out. Now we can put this into our chuck and we can start getting the shape we want, and then we can start hollowing out the inside of the pot as well. Give that a little flick to seat that chuck securely. Now we can mount our pot in the chuck. And tighten that down nice and snug. And I do both pinion gears just to make sure I get a nice grip. Give that a quick spin. All right, now we can bring up our tool rest. And then I'll come from this side and start necking the pot down a little bit. If you're getting a little bit of chatter, we can bring up our tailstock temporarily. Just give us a little extra support as we finish rounding this down. All right. Just working to get the curvature of the pot that I'd like. It will have a rounded bottom, so I wanted to have a nice continuous curve around the body. So from the neck, a nice little OG there, a nice radius here on the body down to a rounded base, similar to this. And then this piece right here, that's where I'm going to keep my bead. I think it's a nice little decorative touch on the pot. That bowl gouge is a little overkill, so I'm going to go to my spindle gouge. And because I'm not way over the rest, I don't need the extra strength from a bowl gouge. And like Richard Raffin says, spindle gouges are a lot cheaper, so you might as well use these as much as you can instead of wearing out the steel on your more premium priced bowl gouges as well. There we go, I think that curve's coming along nice. And then, as soon as I get to where my bead's gonna be, I rotate that flute over so I'm cutting more on the tip of the tool, allows me to get in there. And you can see everything's a bevel riding cut pretty much so far, so it's left behind a really clean surface. But now I'm gonna cut my bead, and then we can establish the rest of the curves we need to that bead. You can roll the bead by hand if you want to. I'm gonna be using the Easy Wood beading cutter. I think it's a nice little tool. When I'm using the beading cutter, I wag the handle back and forth to make sure I get a full, nice, rounded bead. So come over, just kind of rotate that side to side. And then we should have a nice, perfectly rounded bead. Now I'll get my spindle gouge, and then I'm going to cut my curvature down to the bottom of the bead. Rotate my flute over, close that up. If your body's getting in the way, come from the other side with the tool. And then if you need to, because I really want to get down into that bottom of the bead, get that nice crisp detail. So I'm going to take my tailstock out of the way, and then I'm going to cut from this direction with my 3/8 spindle gouge. And then I'm just going to clean up that bead just a hair back with the beading cutter. And then I'm going to come back in here, just finish up cleaning up that cut. So we should have a nice crisp bead. I've got a little bit of torn grain. I'm going to do one more cut there and just clean that up. But you can see at the front of that bead, it's nice and crisp down into the bottom of that radius right here. It looks like we've got a nice contour from here to the exterior. So I'm pleased with that. I think the neck diameter is a pretty good size considering the size of the base of the pot. I think the aesthetics look pretty good. I just want to clean up this detail, and then we can start hollowing out our pot. Once we hollow out the pot, we'll flip this around and then finish rounding off the bottom of our pot here, get a nice rounded base, similar to like a calabash type bowl. But let's go ahead and clean that up now. I'll get my 3/8 spindle gouge, just pick up the cut. And then you can see as I get to the bottom of that bead, I close that flute over, so I'm cutting just on the tip of that, and then I won't catch the wing cutting into the bead as well. So that sycamore gets a little stringy when you're getting down in there, but it's definitely a lot cleaner surface. I'll face this off, clean up that surface. Alright, one thing I want to do when I hollow this pot out is I do want to set my depth. And you can use the tailstock to drill it, or you can just drop the speed way down. And what I've done is I'm just holding my keyless chuck, and I'll just freehand drill this up to my tape line. Actually move this out of the way a little bit. Once I hit my tape line, that's my depth. So I don't want to go past that. What I'm looking for is roughly an 1/8 inch to 3/16 thick wall thickness. And that'll just help me as I'm hollowing this out. Because this pot has a fairly small opening, the shavings will get kind of bound up in there, and it's going to be hard to see exactly where you're at with the tool, and it's going to be going mostly by feel for when we hit the bottom of the pot where that drill hole stops. So now that we have that open, we can start hollowing this out. So we'll bump our speed back up. Tool rest is just a touch high. You see we got a little skate there. If you're using a spindle gouge to hollow this out, it's a little more prone to skating than the bowl gouge just because of the profile on the bevel. So when you're using a spindle gouge, we don't want to have a skate right here. So make sure that flute's totally closed and the handles, you got your bevel in the direction you want to travel until you're on bevel, and then you can open that up just a little bit. I want to use a gouge to cut the majority of the opening because it's a bevel riding cut and it'll cut a lot cleaner surface right here that you'll see. And then once we start opening up the bowl of the pot here, we'll go to a scraper. But I want to have a pretty clean surface with this. And this wet sycamore tears out fairly bad. So if I use a scraper here at the opening, it's definitely going to tear those out. And we're not going to be sanding this. So I want to have as good of a surface as I can have off of a tool. So I will be using the spindle gouge for basically the first third of this pot. Good little skate. Just use the heel of the tool to kind of scrape some of those shavings out of the way so you can see what you're doing. One thing that's worth noting is because of the shape of this pot, where it's flaring out like this, that bevel direction does definitely start pointing this way. I have to move my handle quite a ways away to try and ride that bevel to maintain that curve on the inside as we're cutting. So you have to play around with that a little bit. But you can see we're pretty close to our wall thickness, and it's left a really clean surface. I'll use the gouge to hollow out a little more of the bulk, and then we'll go to our scraper. Those shavings definitely get caught up in there. Just kind of use the heel of the tool. I'm just riding the back side of the tool here to get those shavings to clear out. And then I'll use a compressor here to clean this out. So you can see the very first part of the opening is nice and clean. That's from the bevel riding cut. Now we'll go to our scraper to get in that undercut here and open this thing up and get a nice uniform wall thickness. So this is a 1-inch scraper. It's a 1/4 inch thick, and then this has a nice kind of French curve radius on it. That way it'll allow me to get in there, get the angles I need with this curve that we have in our pot. Get a little bit of chatter because we are a ways over the rest now. The one thing that's also worth noting, if you can fit a bigger scraper in the opening, go ahead and use it. I don't think this scraper That's going to be close. We can try it. Obviously the thicker bar is going to give us more stability and less chatter. But there's not going to be much clearance on either side of the tool, so it's definitely got more support, less chatter. But the shavings do get bound up on the tool more. I'm going to switch back to my smaller scraper. Okay, our wall thickness to the bead is really good. I do need to start opening it past the bead right about here. This is all really nice to the bead, and then we're going to open this up and get our thickness we need. We're pretty much, if I look in there, let me clean this out one more time. If I look in there, we've got our depth where we need it. So now I just need to get our wall thickness to where we need. So our max depth is good. Now we'll just start opening up the diameter of the body. Starts getting a little grabby, because right now I'm about 3 inches over the rest, so the tool starts to get a little grabby. You could switch to a negative rake so it isn't so grabby, but the biggest thing is making sure you have your arm on top of the tool, so when it starts biting in, you're stopping that from kicking the tool handle up to you. So what I'll do is I'll usually feel for the center of the bottom. Right now it's right in the bevel. I've got the handle a little bit low, so right now, move this out of the way so I'm not getting screwed up with that. So right now I've got the tool handle a little bit low, so I'm contacting just the bottom bevel. Once I'm on that at the bottom center, I'll raise the handle a little bit until it starts cutting. Okay, we've got a nice curve. It's still a little heavy right here. I think the bottom curve is pretty decent. I've just got to hog out some more material right here. Let's get back in there. See if we can switch back to our bigger scraper and get the angle we need. I think we'll be hitting, yeah, we're going to be hitting the opening. Might switch back to just a standard round nose here just to get that bottom curve. Try and clear the shavings out. If you have an extra heavy thick scraper that's got a 3/8 cross section to it, those are really handy for this kind of thing where you're going a little bit over the rest. That 1/4 inch bar just isn't strong enough for that kind of thing. Gets a little bitey. Okay, I think the bottom curve's good. There's just a little bit more material right here I want to remove, and then I think we'll be pretty much done with the inside. Okay, that feels pretty good. I'll clean up the opening here because I had a little bit of a skate. I'm going to clean up the opening of the pot, and then we'll sand just a little bit of the bead because I have a little bit of rough surface there. Just get my spindle gouge and just clean this up a little bit. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Just double check the inside. If you have a nice little shop light to try and get some light in there, that's definitely handy. But I think we're doing pretty good here with what we've got. So that scraper actually left a pretty clean surface on the inside. And with this, I'm not going to sand the inside because it is green and we're going to microwave it in a warp. Sanding, it's not really going to help. Plus, when we microwave it, it'll raise the grain a lot. It's going to be pretty rough. So we'll do just a little bit of hand sanding on the exterior when we're done. But at the end of the day, this is kind of just a cool warped, artifact pot is what we're going for. So we don't need to be super highly polished and sanded and everything. So, but the opening's clean. The better surface we can get off the tool, obviously, is better. There's a little bit of torn grain here down on the bottom, which we'll address when we flip this around. But that looks pretty good. Our bead's cut clean. We've got a nice contour here with the outside. So I think we're good. I'll take this out of the chuck now. And you can see the opening here. That bevel writing cut with the spindle gouge left a really clean surface, and the scraper did actually surprisingly well on the inside. So we've got a nice opening. We've got a pretty consistent wall thickness all the way down to about here, and then we'll start rounding off the contour to match the inside. But that looks pretty good. I think it's a nice little sized pot as well. So as far as reverse chucking this, I'll get a scrap piece of material. We'll turn it to fit the inside opening of this, kind of a jam fit type of thing, and we'll be using our tailstock for turning the majority of the outside, and then we'll get rid of that just to part off the nub. Got a square bit of material here. This is just some maple. We'll just turn this to round, turn a small tenon to match our chuck jaws. Tool rest is a touch high. Bring that around. We'll use our spindle gouge just to square off the end of this tenon. I'll use that just to clean up this corner. And then I like to chamfer my tenons just a touch. And that should be sized nice for this chuck jaws we've got. That's a much more secure hold than just gripping on a square stock piece. Make sure that's nice and snug, and then we'll round this down to fit the opening of our pot. So we're at our same turning speed. We're about 1500 RPM. Then we'll just round that over, give ourselves a small taper, see where that's fitting up. So if I give myself a little burnish line there, that gives me my diameter of the opening that I need to turn that to. And then we'll just use a small peeling cut here. Let me do a test fit. So it's still just a little oversized. But the other thing too is the square shoulder will register against the face of this and help that run true and give it a little more support as well. Okay, perfect. So I gave it a little bit of a taper. If I pull this off, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to tell, but there's a slight taper, so it's a little bit bigger here near the shoulder than it is here at the start of the tenon. So let's put this on and see if it gets too tight. We might need to remove some more material. Yeah, I don't want to break this opening, so I'm going to take off just a touch of material right here near the shoulder. It's really easy to take too much off and then not have it fit right. But that's running pretty true. True enough for what we need. You can see it's just a hair out around just down here, but that's going to be just fine. So let's bring up our tailstock for support while we turn the bottom piece of this down. Alright, so now that we have this mounted, I do know my overall depth that we drilled to is basically right here at the bottom of this chamfer here. So that's going to be our overall depth, so I'll start just rounding that over and making us have a nice rounded contour to match what we already have here. So I'll bring up my tool rest, turn the speed on, and then I'll grab my 1/2-inch spindle gouge here. We can start removing material. Come back up just a little bit. So look at the contour. I've got a high spot here. I want to match that to where I have a nice radius. So come back up just a little ways and pick up the cut. It always helps to take a step back and just kind of look at the shape you have. And then you'll see obviously the glaring errors if there's too much material here or up here on the shoulder. And then you just start peeling those down. That looks better. Get my tool rest in there just a touch closer. I'll use my 3/8 spindle gouge to get in there and try and remove as much of that nub as possible. Before we take that off, I just want to inspect the surface, see if we need to clean this up, because I don't want to cut the nub off and then have to come back and clean some of this up here. So there's a little bit of torn grain right here. I'm going to shear scrape that to try and get rid of that. Because this is bowl grain orientation, I can shear scrape uphill a little bit and get a pretty clean cut. So I'll go back to my bowl gouge. I'm going to drop my handle and I'll be cutting on the bottom wing here, just lightly dragging that up the surface. You can see that's giving a really nice fine shaving. Need to rotate my rest around just a touch as well. Drop that handle, rotate that flute closed, cutting on the bottom wing. We're hitting that end grain. I'm going to come back from this side, do the same thing. And that surface is a little out of round, so we're getting a little bit of bounce off the tool. Okay, it definitely cleaned up the torn grain we had. Now I've got just a little bit of a divot. I'm going to shear scrape that away. There we go, that's nice and smoothed out now. Before we get rid of the nub, I also will just hit this with a little bit of sandpaper. Just smooth out the surface if there's any imperfections or anything you want to get rid of. Go ahead and do that now. Again, once we microwave this, it'll raise the grain really bad, and you'll need to do some hand sanding after. So don't spend too much time sanding the piece unless you have some really bad torn grain. Just gonna touch up the bead a little bit. This is just some 220. We had a pretty clean surface from the tool, so it's really smooth to the surface now. But the better surface you can get off the tool obviously will save you a lot of time sanding. And plus, with this project, we're not looking for a really highly sanded piece as well. So bring my tool rest back up. All right, so I'll use a small Japanese handsaw just to cut off the nub. Okay, that'll leave a pretty clean cut there because we're not cutting through traditional spindle fibers. Now we can use our spindle gouge and just get a nice clean cut on the bottom there. And depending on the fit of your jam chuck, you may need to kind of support this a little bit with your support hand. So let's bring up our rest. I'll get my 3/8 spindle gouge. And then I'll start with the bevel writing. And right now I've got just a light, gentle grip with my support fingers. And then we'll ride that bevel and just try and cut that nice and clean. The biggest thing is my thumb is pushing the piece into our jam chuck, and then my other fingers are just kind of stabilizing the piece so it doesn't start getting too crazy out of control. But the biggest thing, make sure you're starting on your bevel, and then you can change the angle of the handle to where the cutting edge starts cutting, making sure to support with the support hand. And that'll leave a clean surface, and we'll just touch that up with our 220. And then that has left a good surface down on the bottom. We'll take this off the jam chuck, and that's a sweet little pot. So you can see the surface we left with the tool was pretty clean, but let's go throw this in the microwave. That'll pull a lot of the moisture out, and it'll get it to warp really nice and give us a really cool looking pot. So I'll go pop this in the microwave and I'll be right back. Alright, so we've just taken this out of the microwave. It's still really hot to the touch. Obviously after you microwave it, it's going to be smoking, steaming hot, so don't burn yourself. But we had it in there for a minute and a half. I'd say a minute to 2 minutes is pretty good for time, but you could see the opening on this pot's nice and oblong now. It's warped quite a bit. If you look at the bead, the decorative bead from my angle here, it's kind of wavy now. We got a nice, good movement out of the piece, and then no cracking obviously because we got a nice uniform, consistent wall thickness. But yeah, it's a really cool looking pot now. So I'll let this cool, but the grain is nice and raised now because it's pulled all that moisture up to the surface. So it's nice and rough. We'll hit this with some 320 sandpaper, and then we'll throw some oil on it and then call it a day with this piece. But if you do a bunch of these little artifact pots, you could obviously add some wood burning to it, do some Native American hieroglyphs or something on it, give it some cool things. I know Richard Raffin does some gilder's paste, some reactive metal paints. Sometimes he'll paint the inside of the pot a different color. Go ahead and check out his work, his channel as well. He's got some really good turning videos. But we'll let this dry for just a second. We'll grab some sandpaper and then just soften up that raised grain. So I've got my 320 grit sandpaper. I'll just hit this up by hand, just soften up that raised fibers from microwaving it. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but it does make it a little nicer to pick up and hold because it's not so rough. Okay, give it a good feel. Make sure there's no torn grain anywhere that's going to be uncomfortable to handle. That feels pretty good, and I've also softened up the inside of that opening as well. So now that we're done sanding, just blow that off with the air compressor, and then I'll just throw a quick coat of tried and true oil on it just to help it match up the color on these other ones, because Sycamore it's got a pretty color to it. As far as the finish you put on it, doesn't really matter what it is. You could use any food safe stuff, you know, whatever finish you want to use, even just wax. Just something to get that natural color back out in the piece. If you wanted to, you could even do some flame texture, get a torch and kind of burn the outside to make it look more, you know, ancient looking. Do some wood burning, put some different markings on it, make it look like, you know, like a hunter-gatherer pot, something cool. Because that's really what this project is, you know, it's just a fun decorative project. You know, you get 2 or 3 of these, get a little set. It's a nice little table display. Get some oil down in the pot. We'll set our rag off to the side so it can dry. Obviously it's a flame hazard, so set it out, let it air dry before you throw it in your trash. And then I'm just getting a clean rag and just wiping away any excess oil. I'm not going to apply any more coats. Just 1 coat is all I need just to darken it up to match the natural color of these other pots. So if you wanted to, you could throw some dye on there, do wood burning, whatever you want to do to accent the pot. But that's all we are going to do with this today. It's a cool looking little piece, nice and oval, has a lot of character because of the warping to it. But once you get a nice set of these, it's pretty cool looking to have. So hopefully you guys learned some different turning tips and techniques. Obviously check out Richard Raffin's video on turning a green pot. He's the master at that. He's definitely got some really good content on YouTube. So thanks to him for letting me see his video and kind of get inspired to turn some of these. Really fun project. Cheap for the material. It's nice turning green wood. Obviously it's a lot less dusty. So get out to your lathe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the section below, and then subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos. Make sure that flute's totally closed until you have bevels